You can hear the whispers in the night, but dare you answer? Until they started calling your name. Who's really calling to you from the shadows? It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just 3 friends and the lure of untouched wilderness. Natalie, Jared, and Vanessa packed light, carrying only essentials for a 2-day hike through deepwood forest. The brochure promised scenic trails, peaceful camping, and breathtaking views. What it didn't mention were the whispers of those who had entered and never left. The trio arrived early Saturday morning, their car the only one parked at the forest entrance. The air was crisp, the sky cloudless, and the towering trees seemed to welcome them with open arms. But as they stepped onto the trail, Jared couldn't shake a strange sensation, like they were being watched. "Did you guys hear that?" Jared stopped abruptly. "Hear what?" Vanessa asked, her tone dismissive. "It sounded like footsteps behind us." Natalie chuckled nervously. "Probably just an echo. Come on, let's keep moving." They pressed on, the forest swallowing them in its green embrace. Hours passed as they trekked deeper, following a poorly marked trail. Jared, the self-proclaimed navigator, insisted they were on track, though the map seemed less reliable with each step. The sun began to sink, casting long shadows that danced like specters among the trees. When they reached a small clearing to set up camp, an uneasy silence blanketed the area. There were no chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet that weighed heavy on their spirits. "I don't like this," Natalie whispered as they lit a small campfire. "Relax," Jared replied. "We're fine, just overthinking it." But as night fell, the forest came alive with eerie sounds, branches snapping, distant murmurs, and faint, guttural noises that seemed too close for comfort. Vanessa froze, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Jared scoffed, though his voice wavered. "Probably just an animal." "Then why does it sound like it's circling us?" Natalie's voice trembled. They huddled close to the fire, each gripping whatever they could find as a weapon. An old hiking stick, a rusted tent peg. The noises grew louder, more deliberate, as if something or someone was toying with them. At midnight, the whispers started, soft at first, barely audible over the crackling fire. But as the hours dragged on, they became unmistakable, taunting, echoing voices that seemed to come from every direction. "Jared," Natalie's voice was barely a whisper. "I think we need to leave." "Now? Leave? In the middle of the night? Are you crazy?" "I'd rather be crazy than dead," she snapped. Reluctantly, they packed their things, extinguishing the fire before slipping into the darkness. Jared led the way with his flashlight, its beam barely piercing the suffocating black. The trail they had followed so confidently earlier was now unrecognizable, as if the forest had rearranged itself. Vanessa stumbled. "Wait, this can't be right. Didn't we pass that tree before?" Jared's frustration boiled over. "How should I know? Everything looks the same." Panic set in as they realized they were hopelessly lost. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more insistent, until they sounded like cries of anguish. Then came the laughter, low, guttural, and utterly inhuman. "Run!" Jared shouted, and they did, their feet pounding against the uneven ground. The flashlight flickered, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to reach for them. Natalie screamed as something cold brushed against her arm, but when she turned, nothing was there. Vanessa tripped and fell, her cries swallowed by the darkness. Jared and Natalie stopped to help her up, but as they did, the laughter turned into a deafening roar. Through the chaos, they saw it, a figure standing just beyond the trees. It was impossibly tall, its limbs contorted, its face obscured by darkness. But its eyes, they glowed a sickly yellow, piercing through the void. "Don't look at it!" Natalie screamed, dragging Vanessa to her feet. They ran blindly, the figure always just behind them, its guttural growls reverberating through the forest. By dawn, they stumbled into another clearing, their lungs burning and legs trembling. The creature was gone, but so was the trail. Exhausted, they collapsed, only to realize the clearing was not empty. Rusted camping gear, torn clothes, and scattered bones littered the ground, remnants of those who had come before. And then they saw the carving on a nearby tree. No way out. Natalie sobbed, her voice breaking. What do we do? We're trapped. Before Jared could answer, a shadow fell over them. They turned as one, their screams echoing through the forest. The Rangers found their abandoned car days later, the keys still in the ignition. Despite extensive searches, no trace of the trio was ever discovered. Deepwood Forest remains open to hikers, though locals warn against venturing too far, because sometimes the woods don't let you leave. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace and isolation. For years, Adrian, Claire, and Thomas had talked about getting away from the chaos of city life. When Adrian stumbled across an ad for Echo Isle, a small, secluded island available for private rental, it felt perfect. Just one cabin, surrounded by dense trees and bordered by a pristine lake. It sounded like paradise. The boat ride to the island was uneventful, the water smooth as glass. The old boatman, an elderly man with sun-weathered skin and vacant eyes, said little as he ferried them across. But as they approached the island, his voice cracked with a strange urgency. Leave by sundown Sunday, he muttered, staring at the horizon. No one stays after dark. Adrian smirked, dismissing the warning as local superstition. Thomas laughed it off, and Claire, always the skeptic, rolled her eyes. By the time they set foot on the island, the warning was forgotten. The cabin was rustic, but comfortable, with large windows offering views of the lake. They unpacked quickly and spent the day exploring. The air was filled with the scent of pine, the sound of lapping water, and an eerie, pervasive quiet. That first night, as they sat around the campfire, the silence became unsettling. There were no insects, no distant calls of birds, only the sound of their own voices and the occasional ripple on the lake. Why is it so quiet here? Claire asked, her voice low. Too quiet, Thomas joked, trying to lighten the mood. Maybe the fish are in on the boatman's creepy warnings. Adrian chuckled, but the laughter felt forced. Something about the stillness didn't sit right with him. Around midnight, Claire heard it first, a faint echo, as if someone were repeating their laughter from across the lake. Did you guys hear that? She asked, sitting up straight. Hear what? Adrian replied, but before she could answer, it came again, clearer this time. Laughter, not their laughter. The trio froze, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the campfire's glow. The sound repeated, closer now, mimicking Thomas's laugh perfectly. Adrian, Thomas whispered, did you? Shut up, Adrian snapped, standing and grabbing a flashlight. He shone the beam into the trees, but the dense foliage revealed nothing. It's probably just an echo, Claire offered, though her voice trembled. But the laughter didn't fade. It grew louder, shifting into whispers. Low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from every direction at once. We're going inside, Adrian said, his voice firm. They retreated to the cabin, locking the door behind them. For hours, they sat in tense silence, but the noises didn't stop. Whispers, laughter, and faint footsteps circled the cabin, growing more erratic as the night dragged on. By morning, the sounds were gone. They convinced themselves it had been their imagination, a trick of the island's acoustics. Determined to salvage the trip, they spent the day hiking. In the heart of the island, they stumbled upon something unexpected, an old stone well, its edges weathered and covered in moss. Surrounding it were wooden carvings of faces, each grotesque and distorted. "This is creepy," Claire said, stepping back. "Locals must have built it ages ago," Thomas suggested, though he couldn't hide his unease. As they stared at the well, a chill ran through the air, and for a moment, it felt like they weren't alone. Claire swore she heard faint whispers rising from the well, but when she leaned closer, it was silent. That night, the echoes returned with a vengeance. It began with their voices, distorted and eerie, calling from outside the cabin. "Thomas, Claire, Adrian." Claire screamed as the voice calling her name sounded like Adrian's. But Adrian was right beside her, pale and shaking. "Who's out there?" Adrian yelled, grabbing a knife from the kitchen. The answer came in the form of heavy footsteps on the porch. The door rattled violently, as if something massive was trying to get in. "Stop it," Claire shouted, tears streaming down her face. But then the footsteps moved to the windows. A shadow passed by, tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long. Adrian lunged for the curtains, yanking them shut. "Don't look at it." Thomas was trembling now, clutching a flashlight like it was his lifeline. "What do we do?" "We wait until morning," Adrian said, his voice trembling. "We don't open the door, no matter what." But the noises didn't stop. Whispers turned into screams. Something pounded on the walls, shaking the cabin to its foundation. And then came the laughter again. This time, all three of their voices, echoing in unison. By dawn, the island was silent again. "We're leaving," Adrian announced, throwing their belongings into bags. But when they reached the dock, the boat was gone. Panic set in as they realized they were stranded. The echoes began again, this time in the daylight, growing louder with every passing minute. Shadows darted between the trees, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Their screams echoed across the lake, blending with the laughter that never stopped. The boatman returned Sunday evening as promised, but the island was empty. The cabin stood untouched, their belongings still inside. No sign of Adrian, Claire, or Thomas was ever found. Locals say Echo has always been cursed, a place where the voices of the lost linger, calling out to lure others into the unseen. The boatman still ferries visitors across, though he never waits for them to return. The beach house sat at the edge of a forgotten shore, where waves crashed endlessly against jagged rocks. Mia, Ethan, and Lila had rented it for a weekend getaway, lured by its remote charm and promise of solitude. The brochure had mentioned its history, a house built in the 1800s by a reclusive musician, but failed to mention the darker rumors. As they arrived, the first thing they noticed was the eerie stillness. The beach was deserted, the air heavy with the scent of salt and decay. The house itself was a weathered structure, its paint peeling and windows fogged with grime. "Charming," Lila muttered, pulling her jacket tighter against the cold. "It's got character," Ethan said, forcing a grin. Mia, ever the optimist, nodded. "We'll make it cozy." The interior was surprisingly well maintained, with antique furniture and faded rugs. But the grand piano in the corner of the living room drew their attention. Its lid was open, the keys yellowed with age. "Looks like it hasn't been played in decades," Ethan said, running a hand over the wood. "Maybe it shouldn't be," Lila replied, eyeing the instrument warily. They spent the day exploring the beach, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere shifted. The house seemed to creak and groan, its wooden frame protesting against the weight of time. At midnight, Mia was the first to hear it. She had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when the soft strains of a melody drifted through the house. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, shaking Ethan awake. "Hear what?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "The music, it's coming from downstairs." Reluctantly, Ethan followed her to the living room. where the piano now sat in the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the window. The melody was unmistakable, haunting and beautiful, yet deeply unsettling. "No one's here," Ethan said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Mia reached for the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. The music stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. "It's probably just the wind," Ethan said, though they both knew better. The next morning, Lila complained of vivid nightmares. "I dreamt someone was standing over me, whispering, singing." Mia and Ethan exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. That night, the music returned, louder this time. The notes twisted and warped, echoing through the house like a mournful wail. Lila woke screaming, her voice raw with terror. "It was in my room," she sobbed. "I swear it was standing right there." "What was?" Ethan demanded, his patience fraying. "I don't know," Lila cried. "A shadow, a figure. It was singing." Determined to prove it was nothing, Ethan marched to the piano. "Look, it's just an old house. There's nothing." He stopped mid-sentence as the piano played a single, discordant note, the key pressing down of its own accord. "That's it. We're leaving," Mia said, her voice trembling. But when they tried the door, it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were locked tight, though none of them had touched them since arriving. "What the hell is going on?" Ethan muttered, his bravado crumbling. The hours stretched endlessly as the house came alive. The walls seemed to hum, and shadows flickered just beyond their vision. At midnight, the singing began again. This time, it wasn't confined to the piano. The melody seeped from the walls, the floor, the very air. It was a voice, high and sorrowful, yet filled with malice. The lyrics were unintelligible, but the intent was clear. "It's trying to trap us," Lila whispered, her face pale. "Why? What does it want?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "To keep us here," Mia said, her eyes wide with realization. "It doesn't want to be alone." Desperate, they searched the house for answers. In the attic, they found a collection of old sheet music, each page marked with erratic scrawls. Among them was a journal belonging to the house's original owner, a composer named Elias Crane. The entries grew darker as they read, detailing his descent into madness. Elias had believed the house was alive, feeding on the music he created. In his final entry, he wrote of a final composition, a melody meant to bind his soul to the house forever. "He never left," Mia said, her voice barely audible. The singing grew louder, the voice now joined by faint laughter. The air turned icy, and the house began to shake. "We have to destroy the piano," Ethan said, grabbing a fire poker. As they raced downstairs, the piano seemed to resist, its keys slamming down in chaotic fury. The melody twisted into a scream, and a shadowy figure materialized beside it. A gaunt, hollow-eyed man with a twisted grin. "Play for me," the figure hissed, its voice like shattered glass. Ethan swung the poker with all his strength, shattering the piano's lid. The figure screamed, its form flickering like a dying flame before vanishing. The house fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. By dawn, the door unlocked, and they fled without looking back. Months later, the house was listed for rent again, its description unchanged. No one mentioned the music, nor the shadows that lingered. But locals whispered of Elias Crane, the composer whose melody still haunts the beach house at midnight, waiting for new musicians to join his eternal symphony.